The little girl walks to meet her father late in the evening. She does not know why her father called her so unexpectedly, but assumes it has to do with her birthday, which is tomorrow. However, upon entering the room, the child immediately senses the strange mood of a stranger. The father's servant grabs the girl's hand while the man speaks of a sacrifice, in which the girl will be the victim. Thus, on the night before her birthday, the closest person to the little girl, her father, betrays and abandons her. 6 years later, this girl, now grown up, finds herself in a dangerous situation on the street. Bandits surround her and the maid who is with her. Rena Rubel, the main character, is very scared and cannot protect herself. While the villains prepare to capture and sell both girls for a large sum, all Rena and her maid can do is cower in a corner and beg not to be harmed. Rena also tries to use her status as the Marquis's daughter, but the bandits do not believe her. They would not have been saved if a man in a cloak with a masked face had not come to their aid. The stranger turned out to be much stronger than the bandits and easily defeated them one by one. The girls did not immediately trust the stranger, thinking he too intended to sell them. However, the man revealed his face and reassured the frightened girls, offering to escort them home. Eventually, they found themselves lodging with a stranger. The young man was surprised at how easily Rena and her servant followed the first person they met. It was dangerous to be so carefree in the capital. The main character was not too concerned, enjoying the delicious food that the young man had offered them. Besides, she knew his name was Lignan, so it could be considered that they were acquainted. However, Lignan was worried about Rena's safety and gave her a dagger for self-defense. The girl thought the young man was charming, but Lignan assumed that she was foolish because of her demeanor. Later that night, Lignan entered the room where the young woman was sleeping and woke her up, forcing her to get out of bed. Within minutes, one of the bandits who had attacked the main character burst into the room. 2 other men were with him, demanding that they hand over the girl. After they refused, the bandits summoned a monster, which surprised Lignan greatly. He fought the huge creature while Rena stood before him, naively demanding that they stop. The young man pushed the main character aside, but the monster had already spotted her and decided to attack. To everyone's surprise, Rena easily killed the monster with the dagger that Lignan had given her. For a few seconds, everything around froze, but then the gang leader did not lose his composure and began to transform into a monster with the help of a stone he used to summon the creature. His eyes turned black with red pupils, and fangs grew from his teeth. He bit one of his men on the neck, drank a bit of his blood, and then lunged at the main heroine. Rena, with equal ease, killed the second opponent. The other 2 bandits were very frightened. The main heroine questioned them about the altar stone used by their leader and then took it for herself. Uni, the girl's servant, emerged from under the bed with cat ears on her head. The girls ordered the villains to give up everything they had to atone for their sins. On the next morning, Rena and Uni acted as if nothing had happened, but Lignan couldn't help but ask the girls about what had happened. As it turned out, they were not showing weakness but were merely observing propriety when they were being kidnapped. In fact, they were dispensing justice for themselves and other girls. However, not everything always goes smoothly. At this moment, Lignan feels very foolish. He had tried so hard to protect the girls, even the dagger he had given them had no real meaning. Then the main heroine changed the subject and showed him the altar stone she had received from the criminal. Lignan said he was looking for this object. A century ago, the altar that opened the doors to hell appeared on Earth and completely changed the history of mankind. Lignan learned that the altar was in this city, so he stayed here on his way to the capital. Now the stone belongs to the girl, and Lignan has no intention of taking it away. However, Rena herself gives up the item as a token of gratitude for the kindness shown to them. The boy accepts the gift. Now the young man is planning to go to the Imperial Palace but cannot take the girls with him since the group has already been formed. Rena is not upset by this and suggests meeting at the destination. Lignan returned to his nightly squad. His reconnaissance went very well as the altar was found. Now it is time to continue the journey to the capital. The whole group moves forward on horseback. Lignan remembers the words of the main heroine about him being cute and realizes that he also feels sympathy for this strange girl. She pretends to be weak, but is very strong. He smiles as he thinks about her and imagines how the girl will react to the news that Lignan is a duke in the east. The man's musings are interrupted by one of his squad members who notices the Lord's happy face. Lignan decides to find out if the Marquis has a daughter, whom the main heroine pretended to be. As it turns out, the man's daughter is considered dead. Lignan plans to learn more about this when he meets this unusual girl again. Rena and Uni are also traveling in a carriage and talking about their new acquaintance. They never really figured out who this young man was, but judging by his clothing, he wasn't very wealthy. Nevertheless, the girls can only find out more about him if they meet him again. In the Emperor's palace, the main heroine is certain to meet her father and is planning to give him a chance to ask for forgiveness. In her early childhood and until the age of 6, the main heroine lived in a separate estate. Her mother had to give birth and raise an heir, so she was forced to abandon her daughter. During all this time, the little girl suffered greatly from loneliness. All she could do was dutifully look at portraits of her parents, whom she had never seen. It was only when she turned 6 that she returned home and thought that she would now be very happy. Yuni and Rena's carriage approached the palace. The maid even saw it from the window. The huge palace was festively decorated, and happy people in beautiful outfits walked around. The queue at the entrance was huge, and the girls were able to pass only thanks to a special invitation. Otherwise, they would have had to wait in line until late at night. As soon as both girls were in their room, the main heroine put on a beautiful dress and went to meet her father. At the entrance to the Marquis's room, she was met by guards who did not intend to let her in and only handed her a letter with very rude content. Unexpectedly, the butler appeared and still allowed the main heroine to enter. The man pretended not to believe the girl and was sure that she was just pretending to be the Marquis's daughter. Then Renee told the story of how the butler laid a carpet on the stairs right outside her room, as she constantly fell off them as a child. This did not change anything and only angered the man. He offered the girl tea and suggested she leave. In the tea, he added poison, despite the fact that he was very sorry for the young lady. Renee hinted that she knew about the poison but still drank the tea. After that, she ran to her room to spit everything out in the wash basin. However, her legs still became numb. It was probably a type of neurotoxin, and if the girl had not reacted to it immediately, she would have been paralyzed and died soon after. Renee laughs about it, and the maid does not understand why. Afterwards, the servant questioned the young woman about the meeting and was surprised that the letter passed on by her father had seemed touching to her. In it, he had written that he was deeply mourning the loss of his daughter, which gave the young woman hope that the man regretted his actions. That was why she became a little confused in her thoughts, but it was foolish to assume that the poison would go unnoticed. The young woman finds it particularly amusing how the butler turned pale, just as soon as Renee gave him a sidelong glance. Yuni, in any case, does not understand why the young woman drank the poison. Even if she knew she would remain alive, she would still have to go through pain. The next morning, the Marquis will surely come to check whether the young woman is dead. Then she will finally be able to meet him in person. Nevertheless, there is a risk that they will send a hired killer next time. Yuni worries about this and even suggests switching places with the main heroine in bed to protect her. At night, Renee cannot sleep because of the heat, most likely caused by the poison she took. The young woman goes out to the balcony and hears music from the banquet. She would have been able to enjoy herself as well if it weren't for her father's betrayal. The young woman jumps off the balcony into the garden. Someone approaches her from behind, and she is greatly frightened, thinking it is the assassin her father sent. The young woman forgot her self-defense weapon in her room, but it was not necessary anyway. Lignan asked her if she managed to meet her father, although he already knew that she was stopped at the very doors. The heroine was once again in just her nightgown, and Lignan draped his jacket over her shoulders. The young man was curious as to why the young woman was so desperate to have this meeting. But first he had to tell her something about himself. He had not revealed his origins to the heroine before, fearing it would repel her. The young woman found this charming. Lignan asked her to come to him if nothing came of her meeting with her father. Then the heroine realized Lignan's status, and they both hoped to meet again during such a nocturnal stroll. In the morning, the Marquis Rubel received a letter from his daughter. She promised to explain why she came and what her further plans were, if her father explained why he had been so cruel to her many years ago. The man was angry. He did not understand how the young woman could have survived a lethal poison, and it could not have been the fault of the butler, as he was a responsible person and even promised to resolve the matter. At that moment, his chambermaid entered the room and informed him that the young woman had come at the invitation of the Duke of the Southern Lands. This surprised the father of the girl, and then he realized that if she was invited by the Duke, then such disrespect towards her was punishable, as she was not even allowed into the room, and then they even tried to kill her. At that moment, Renee and her maid arrived at Bill Alex Grash's, Duke of the Southern Lands, palace. He was very surprised that the girl had already managed to visit her father, although she had just arrived at the palace and had not said anything to him, the one who had invited her. Renee apologized for not coming to greet the Duke first, but the man was not worried about that. He had called a hired killer, and a woman had arrived. During the war with the undead, who roamed the surrounding area, and became aggressive upon hearing any sound, Duke Alex's army was nearly destroyed. He thought he was the only survivor, but then he saw a weak-looking knight who managed to defeat all the undead. This knight was the young heroine, and now the Duke was concerned that she was a woman. The Duke doubts that the knight he invited is who he claims to be, but the heroine did not pretend to be a man. She was wearing armor on the battlefield, which was appropriate for the situation. Alex remembers that the knight never introduced himself as a man, so it happened just as it was meant to. Now the question arises about the relationship between the heroine and the marquis she visited. The girl tells the truth that he is her father, and the Duke understands that she is in a difficult position. He decides not to ask any further questions about it. The heroine asks for protection from Alex, and he agrees, but only on the condition that it won't bring problems to the south, which has just achieved a fragile stability. The girl assures him not to worry, she will handle everything correctly. The Grassa Empire rose in the place of the destroyed kingdom thanks to the first emperor. It was divided into north, south, west, and east. Each of these lands was ruled by a member of the royal family. In the east, the illegitimate son of the previous duke, Lignan Aderner, who was despised by others because of his birth, was in charge. In the west, Calvis Celestium Grassa, who lost the war and became a cardinal in the capital, was in power. In the south, Bill Alex Gracia, who recently won the war and survived thanks to the heroine, was ruling. In the north, the son of the first duke who died in battle, Ira Plenus Grassa, was in power. The four dukes were at odds with each other, and each year the situation became more and more heated. Currently, 3 out of 4 have gathered for an audience, with Lignan being deemed unworthy and thus not invited. The discussion revolves around the alleged use of a woman by the Duke of the South to insult the Marquis of the North. The Duke of the Northern Lands did not appreciate this and hinted that it could lead to war. The former Duke of the West tried to calm the others by diverting the topic to their common enemy, Lignan. All agreed that not inviting him was the right decision, as he is not a member of the imperial family. At that moment, the door opened and Lignan entered, dragging along a man who refused to disclose the location of the gathering. He was furious and showed no particular manners, even putting his feet up on the table, as caution around such traitors was deemed unnecessary. Immediately after this, the dukes left, leaving Lignan alone, as they did not wish to continue the meeting in his presence. In the evening, Lignan returns to his room, relieved that the meeting has ended. He realizes that he had no choice but to call people much older than him rats. He also finds out that the girl he had taken a liking to was invited to the imperial ball by the Duke of the South, someone who despises him. He regrets that the main character has turned out to be his enemy. Several hours before the meeting of the dukes, Renée returns to her room and finds an invitation to the imperial ball. It was a cunning test, as a negative opinion would be formed if she did not show up or find a partner. At the banquet, the guests are chatting about how wonderful the event is. Suddenly, one of them mentions the main heroine, whose appearance in the palace has caused quite a stir. From this conversation, Cardinal Celestium, who is also present in the hall, learns about Renée and her background. He is surprised by this information. When Renée herself appears in the hall, all eyes turn to her. The aristocrats openly sneer at her, looking disapprovingly and whispering about her naivety. The cardinal watches with interest, curious to see how the young woman will handle this difficult situation. A crowd of aristocrats gather around Renée, openly mocking her. She came without an escort, which is considered bad form. Suddenly, the main heroine smirks defiantly in response to the taunts, which angers the offenders. The cardinal notes that this is a bold move, but it remains to be seen whether the young woman can use this complex tactic to her advantage. Renée continues to smile, but one lady from the crowd becomes more angry than the others and starts to panic, demanding that the uninvited guest be removed. However, when it turns out that the young woman has an official invitation, the aristocrat simply tries to drag her out of the hall, but Renée easily pushes him away. The main heroine remains just as self-assured, and the cardinal is surprised to see that she is handling the situation well. Their eyes meet, and the man is shocked by what he sees, almost losing his composure. Meanwhile, a fair-haired young man named Rubid is at first sitting on the sidelines, drinking champagne and observing, but then he steps forward and thanks Renée for coming to the event at his invitation. His gaze is slightly crazed as he invites her to dance and asks her not to leave the banquet yet. The young woman realizes that everyone in the hall is watching them, and although she cannot refuse the offer, she declines his offer of a drink. Rubid's eyes become even more manic, and he pours his drink directly onto the head of the main heroine. Rubid justified his actions as a lesson to the main protagonist on not refusing a drink that is offered to her. Afterwards, the brother of the Duke of the Northern Lands offered the lady another drink. She didn't know how to act, with everyone around her laughing at her and supporting her abuser. The main protagonist contemplated whether to respond to him the same way he did to her or to simply punch him in the face. However, she decides to handle the situation differently. She takes the napkin that Rubid gave her after he spilled the drink on her, wipes a living flower from her clothing, and inserts it into the man's glass. She then leaves the room. Renee quickly runs down the hallway. Her plan to make a good impression at the ball had failed because of that man. However, she couldn't stoop down to his level and has no choice but to leave. Only when she remembers what happened in detail, she no longer wants to run away because the scoundrel will win. Renee returns to her room, and her servant is surprised that her mistress has returned so early and in such a state. The main protagonist doesn't want to explain everything right now. She needs to prepare and return to the ball. She orders her servant to prepare her attire, as one does not go to battles in the gown that has become this evening. In the meantime, Cardinal Celestium and Rubid discuss what happened. The Cardinal is deeply saddened by the treatment Renee received despite her efforts to dress up for the occasion, while Rubid remains indifferent and fails to appreciate the young lady's worth. Rubid almost dozes off in his chair, but the Cardinal wakes him up to introduce him to an honored guest from the south, who turns out to be Renee. She invites her shocked aggressor to dance, and he has no choice but to comply as she drags him to the center of the room, squeezing his hand tightly. The dance appears to be a mockery of Rubid, which was Renee's intent. If he had been rude to her, she would return the favor. During the dance, Renee offers to make peace with him, but instead of accepting, the prince becomes even angrier and shouts at her. Renee almost pushes him into the champagne pond in the room but catches him just in time. She bows, thanks him for the dance, and is about to leave when the prince attempts to strike her. She stops his hand with her palm. If she is mistreated again, she will not hesitate to throw him into the champagne and watch with a smile. The Cardinal, who is observing the situation, laughed and applauded the girl's action. The humiliated young man began to use powerful magic out of anger. This magic turned out to be the power of the Northern Lands. The girl was very surprised, but the Cardinal only continued to smile. 100 years ago, when the Empire was almost destroyed by the undead rising from their graves, the last heir of the deceased dynasty came. She rose from the dead and gained power. Her abilities helped destroy the undead and save people. The power was called authority, and the girl divided it among her descendants, who became rulers of different parts of the empire. Rubid inherited the power called torment and was granted the right to use it. Now Rubid approaches the main heroine and offers her to apologize, and he will only partially harm her. The girl remains just as defiant, and Rubid is about to attack her when a man enters and asks the prince to go home. This is the Marquis of the Northern Lands and the father of the main heroine, at the sight of whom the young man immediately calms down. However, he demanded not to hurry him with his return. As soon as Renee sees her father, she immediately moves away from her opponent. She tries to talk to him but receives only a rude and short answer. The Marquis never acknowledged his daughter. Later, the man helps the prince to tidy himself up and thanks him for his support. Even Rubid doubted if the girl was the real daughter of the Marquis, but the latter denies it, attributing it to fraud. Nevertheless, the Marquis scolds the prince a little, as his behavior was not very dignified. In the fight, the boy disgraced himself, and if it happens again, it will greatly affect the reputation of the imperial family. In the end, he praises Rubid again, and even the young man himself cannot understand whether it is a compliment or an insult. The Marquis is glad that the prince is so naive and cannot think rationally about the words of others. The girl is indeed his daughter, but it is easy to hide it from the foolish Rubid. Lignan sits in the night garden and waits for the main heroine. He feels strange vibrations and initially thinks it's an earthquake, but quickly realizes that someone from the imperial family has used a destructive force right in the palace. Lignan assumes it was the second prince from the north, which turns out to be true. The girl is not there yet, and he is about to leave, but she finally emerges from behind the trees. She looks upset, but the young man does not dare to ask her about what happened at the ball. Instead, he bids her farewell and asks her to forget that they ever met in the night garden. He explains that the girl is a guest of the Duke from the south, and judging by the situation, there is a high probability of a battle between the dukes for the new territories, as ordered by the Empress. In this situation, there is a chance that Lignan and the girl will become enemies. The main heroine smiles at this, and from the closeness of the boy, she only wants to continue the conversation even more. The girl points out the foolishness of Lignan's statements and even compares him to the prince who attacked her, which shocks the boy. After that, Renee simply explains to him that they don't have to stop talking, as Lignan used to talk to her before, despite her northern origin. If problems arise, the girl promises to deal with them herself. She is ready to take risks as she finds Lignan attractive. The girl also recalls that when she gave the altar to the boy, he promised to repay her generosity, and now it's time to pay with friendship. Lignan feels uncomfortable with such confident words from the girl, but agrees to take care of her as long as she doesn't become too attached to him. Even though he forces himself to say the rest of the sentence, he asks the main heroine to tell him if she falls in love with him. The girl herself considers such words to be self-centered. Moreover, she is interested in the reason for the boy's fear of love. Nevertheless, she simply calms him down, tears off a flower and gives it to Lignan, suggesting they just have fun together. The father of the main heroine looks out the window, distracted by the cardinal who intentionally came to see the Marquis, and didn't even bother to justify his actions. The man also has many questions about what happened many years ago when the cardinal told him that his daughter would die as a sacrifice. How could everything have turned out this way? The Marquis is worried that the girl will reveal his plans to someone else, but the cardinal is confident that this won't happen, as she only smiled at him during the ball, at the person who sent her to the terrible place. The former duke orders the man to find out what his daughter wants, as she will likely be their enemy, and then he leaves. When the tomb from which the undead came was formed, the cardinal wanted to gain power similar to that of the ruler of the country. Therefore, he constantly sent a huge number of little girls there, and since such actions can be considered treason, the Marquis is forced to conceal it, as he is also on the cardinal's side. Renée walks down the corridor in her southern attire, accompanied by the Duke of the South. Rumors of what happened at the ball have already reached the Duke's ears, but Renée emerged victorious, defending both herself and her region. Therefore, the Duke refrains from scolding the young woman and instead explains the etiquette for today's meeting, as Renée is about to be announced as his successor. Renée understands everything and enters the Empress's hall. Everyone else, including her friend, is already there. He smirks at the man with whom Renée arrived, and she realizes that he is not well liked. Renée casts an angry glance at her father, then stands next to the Duke of the South. The Empress enters the hall, and a hush falls over everyone. She takes her seat on the throne, even forgetting why the gathering was called in the first place, and then orders her servant to read the decree. The order to conquer new territories was indeed issued, but to everyone's surprise, these lands are located within the tomb. This news particularly dampens the spirits of the main heroine. Then the Duke of the South steps forward and asks the Empress for permission to pass on the management of the region to Renée. The ruler agrees, arrogantly looking down at the girl and even slightly injuring her neck with her sword before ordering her to venture into the tomb and risk her life. The meeting ends quickly as the Empress leaves. Many find her frightening, but they are afraid to voice their opinion. Renée returns with the Duke of the South when her father calls her for a talk. The girl does not immediately run to meet him but agrees to spend a little time with him. In the guest room during the conversation, the man makes it clear that he knows who Renée is. He falls to his knees, begging for forgiveness. Renée had always thought that she would be happy at this long-awaited moment. She sits next to her father, listening to his excuses. The Marquis even sheds tears, and Renée would have believed him if she hadn't been poisoned. After realizing that the scene did not go well, the man simply wants to fulfill his daughter's wishes. However, when she asks to be recognized in front of everyone, the Marquis immediately refuses. It is all about the rebellion. If they acknowledge her as alive, then he will be labeled as a traitor to the Empire. He promises Renée a luxurious new life, no worse than his own. However, the main heroine does not need this. She wants to be who she was born to be, even if they used her for the sake of betraying the country. The Marquis realizes that he could not deceive his daughter with fake love and decides to listen to her. The main heroine gives her father a choice. Either he kills his daughter before the conquest of new lands, or he dies by her hand, or he recognizes her as his daughter and be forgiven, although still a traitor. The man does not want to make such a difficult choice. He sent his own child to die, poisoned her when she returned, and now pretends to suffer from a terrible choice, just as he did when the main heroine was a child. 6 years ago, she found herself alone on the city streets. She had just experienced something very frightening when a strange man approached her. He sold her to a girl in a bar, and immediately aggressive men surrounded her. But Renée tried to prove that she was from the aristocracy, shouting out her father's and her own name. She was eventually able to prove it when she showed that she could read and write. The whole time, the little girl cried and was angry at her parents who said they loved her but did this to her. In the end, the bar girl learned about the Duke and his buried daughter. Renée felt something was wrong and decided to check if she could make money from the situation, so she sent the Duke a lock of the girl's hair. On the day of their meeting, they locked the child in a neighboring building. She cried and wanted to go home. Then, the maid arrived and killed the woman who sold Rena, and ordered the bar to be burned. As the owner said the main heroine should have been there. Along with the Baron, they mercilessly burned the guests and staff. The little girl was saved only because they hid her. Rena now recalled how she wept back then and lost all hope for a happy life. After that, she simply left, without saying anything more to her father. The young maid was worried about her mistress, as something bad always seemed to happen to her since she arrived at the palace. This time, the girl came early because she had met with her father. The little servant immediately wanted to hear about what had happened. Rena was hungry, and the maid set a small table for her, although there was no food in their room. As it turned out, many people in the palace cared about the little maid and constantly gave her different treats, which she now shared with Rena. The main protagonist was glad that the girl had settled in well, but warned her that now she, too, could be in danger and ordered her to run as soon as she notices any threat. In the laundry room, Rena's servant was performing her duties well, when her father's butler appeared and offered her some sweets. On the same day, the army for the conquest of the tomb was assembled in the old imperial palace. It was there that the gates to the world of the dead first appeared. The previous time, it was followed by a bloody battle, but now they themselves would open the tomb's gates to conquer the lands inside, as ordered by the Empress. The cardinal in charge of this process thanked everyone for helping to gather the altars and dripped his blood onto them. At that very moment, the tomb opened, and the undead rushed out. The Empire's troops were now ready to defend themselves. An intense battle ensues, with everyone fighting fiercely, trying to kill as many undead as possible. The main heroine leads the way, effortlessly dispatching the undead, but notices that their numbers are too great. Lignan manages to fight and command his troops while leading the charge with dignity. Rena notices that one of her soldiers needs help and saves his life. Suddenly, a huge dragon emerges from the tomb, ready to attack the Duke of the South, and Rena doesn't have time to reach him to save him. Unexpectedly, Lignan comes to the rescue, killing the monster and saving the man who had despised him for so long. The main heroine thanks the boy, smiling brightly at him. When the last undead falls, the troops are barely standing. The cardinal declares that the path is cleared. The soldiers need to guard the entrance to the tomb until it is conquered. The expedition is planned for 10 days later, and the knight's main task will be to bring the crown of the king of the dead to the empress. Lignan checks his troops for wounded and, when he realizes that everything is in order, decides to head back to the palace with his men. However, he is rudely accosted by Rubid, who immediately begins insulting him. The impudent young man from the north demands that the Duke bow down to him as a member of the imperial family. Lignan tries his best to avoid conflict and walks away, not willing to continue the conversation with the fool. However, the prince doesn't want to end it so quickly and continues to insult him, provoking a fight to the death. The situation changes when the main heroine intervenes. She approaches the boys and formally greets Lignan, introducing herself to him as if they were not acquainted. The young woman expresses her gratitude to Lignan for rescuing the Southern Duke, and he responds with a thankful smile, as she has in a way saved him as well. Lignan can now depart peacefully, as the enraged prince follows after him. However, the young woman reminds the prince of proper decorum, and there is no point in arguing about honor. The northern young man does not care whom he fights against, and he still seeks revenge against the young woman for their previous conflict, intending to use his power against her. Fortunately, the cardinal intervenes just in time, preventing the fight from even starting. He informs the prince that his brother has already departed, and he runs after him, directing his anger elsewhere. The former duke grasps the young woman's hand and expresses his desire to speak with her, but she openly states that she has no interest in him, freeing herself from his grasp and walking away. Later, in her room, Rena prepares to leave, despite just returning. Her servant is displeased by her late walks and complains about the young woman's behavior. She also tells Rena about the marquis who gave her sweets. Rena praises her servant for following her advice and making amends with her enemy. The servant is willing to share everything except Rena's nightly walks. The main character gracefully descends from the balcony in a beautiful dress. In the garden, the young woman meets with the Eastern Duke, and both look stunning. During the battle, they were surprised by each other's behavior, finding it amusing and not discussing it further. The young man is concerned about his friend, as she will have to participate in the tomb battle. Although the young woman is skilled on the battlefield, her squad does not appear to be strong enough. Rena reassures him that everything will be all right. She is even looking forward to the tomb battle, as it has become her home, where she has spent most of her childhood. 6 years ago, there was a cliff on the west side of the country overlooking the land of the dead. At the edge of the cliff stood a cardinal with a frightened Rena. She was crying and too afraid to look down, for there were hordes of undead below. The man was going to throw the little girl off the cliff, as the Empress had managed to escape from there alive, and he was hoping to find a girl who resembled her. If Rena could return home alive, she would receive power and authority on par with the country's ruler. He promised to wait for the girl in the land of the living, even if she sought revenge against him, and without hesitation, he threw the child down. Now, the second prince of the north stood near the entrance to the tomb, peering into the crack. The cardinal told him about the cyclicality of time within the land of the dead. At that moment, the eastern troops approached the entrance, preparing to enter inside. The first in command decided to check the situation and ordered his men to wait while he went for reconnaissance. Everything inside seemed very strange to him, and he felt something unusual. However, the ring did not respond, as if there were no undead nearby. Suddenly, the earth beneath his horse shook, and he turned around to see the impudent second prince of the north. Meanwhile, Rena visited the Duke of the South to inquire why the southern knights, who were reputedly very strong, were now behaving as if they had never been in battle. It turned out that the southern knights were busy restoring order in their homeland, and only had raw recruits in their place. Rena received a list of the army and realized that all these people were just children whom their families had sent to certain death to get rid of them, just like herself. The Duke made it clear to her that she had no choice but to take them under her wing and make them worthy representatives of the South. On the training ground, the knights rejected orders from their commander, Rena, who had come to give them directions. They failed to see her as a leader because she came from nowhere and was also a young woman, which made them even more skeptical. They brazenly defied the Lord of the South's orders, and Rena glared at them with anger, wondering what to do in this situation. The haughty gaze of the main protagonist irritates her retinue. One of the knights lunges at the girl with his sword, shouting at Rena, but the girl remains steadfast. The fact that she is a girl does not make her inferior to them. Lignan duels with the second prince of the north. The arrogant lad intends to teach the Duke a lesson, but it immediately becomes clear that he will lose to the eastern Duke. Suddenly, both boys hear a strange sound, which distracts them from their disagreement. Lignan rides towards where the sound came from and finds himself on the edge of a cliff. He cannot continue to ride his horse any further, but in the distance, a castle is visible. It looks strange, as if the lower part is melting away. What amazes the boys even more than its shape is the fact that a castle stands in a world full of foolish undead. Their main enemy, the King of the Dead, must reside there. A terrible crash is heard once again. A huge, terrifying monster wakes up beneath the castle, making it feel as though the castle itself has awoken. After returning, Lignan speaks to one of the knights in the East's library about what happened. The man thinks that the undead is created precisely by the castle. After the incident, they had a hard time finding their way back, but eventually returned in just 15 minutes, despite feeling like it had been over an hour. Lignan then remembers the cardinal's words about time flowing differently inside the tomb, but he remains puzzled. Just as Lignan begins to recover from the shock of visiting such a strange place, the knight tells him another dreadful piece of news, an attack on the main heroine. The lad is afraid that the girl may have been hurt, but as it turns out, he should have been worried about her assailant instead, who was left in a critical condition as a result of the fight. Meanwhile, in Rena's chambers, the girl's servant imagines how greatly the main heroine chastised the insolent attackers who assaulted her. Rumors have greatly exaggerated the situation, but in reality, the situation is quite different. Nevertheless, Rena is concerned about the fact that just a few days before the start of the heavy war, the Southern Knights rebelled in such a way. The servant also hands the lady a letter in which the cardinal invites the girl and a few others to a dinner party. In her uniform, Rena enters the banquet hall. A very strange company has gathered there, indicating that the dinner will be tense. For some reason, the cardinal invited Rena, the prince from the north, with whom the girl had a conflict, and the eastern duke, who was also at odds with the insolent prince. The dinner host begins to speak about the upcoming first expedition into the tomb, declaring that Rena will lead the expedition, and that both north and east will follow her. This information shocks everyone to their core. Although the cardinal has not yet stated this condition as a command, he made it clear that the girl has no choice but to lead all the regions behind her. Earlier, the cardinal had spoken with Rena's father. It turned out that it was her father who spread rumors about how his daughter severely beat one of the southern knights who rebelled against her. This was a necessary part of the plan to kill her. The former duke offered to help the man with this, to lure Rena into a trap. Presumably, this is what the cardinal is doing right now. He is talking about the plan and how the Southern Knights have already been fighting for a long time with those whom they will have to face in the tomb. They know what to do, and this is also an opportunity for revenge for those who killed so many Southerners. The man is very interested in how Rena will react. The girl agrees to lead the troops only if the attack is postponed for a couple of days. Everyone present looks at her in complete shock. During a night walk after the meeting, Rena and the Eastern Duke discuss the upcoming attack. The girl only asked for a 2-day delay because she knew about her father's trap and decided that he would come up with a new plan over a longer period. This made it difficult for her friend, but the guy is not angry. Even though he thinks the main protagonist is strange, he still worries about her life, and this concern is mutual. Therefore, the girl decides to tell him more about the upcoming expedition to keep him safe. On the day of the expedition, Rena gets ready to set out from her chambers with the help of her servant. The Southern Duke bursts into her room, terrified that the girl is going to such a dangerous place all by herself without any knights. He thinks that such a reckless act could lead to death and therefore worries so much. Nevertheless, he trusts the girl and allows her to execute her plan. In response, Rena promises the Duke victory. Before entering the tomb, the northern and eastern troops gathered. Rena is at the head of the squad, ready to lead the people behind her. The cardinal wishes the girl luck and allows her to pass through the crack. There, a crowd of undead already awaits her, so she removes and discards her cloak for convenience, takes her sword out of its scabbard, and begins to fight. In the Empire, there exists a biography of a female ruler who entered the tomb. There it is told how the crack appeared and how almost the entire world fell to the attacks of the dead. The girl, who was the last of her kind, entered that terrible place with only one blade. At the end of her long journey, she met the rulers of that place, who revealed to her the name tomb and introduced themselves as her ancestors. As it turned out, even after death, the kings retained their titles. They wanted power, but not over the dead. Their goal was to emerge to the surface and establish their rule there. The girl tried to dissuade them, as it was not their land, but the dead rulers refused to listen to her. They emitted sounds resembling muffled cries. They had no eyes, but they were perfectly oriented to sound. If they heard any noise, they would immediately kill their victim. The ruler of that place was known as the so-called king who swallowed the first scream. When the empress first met him, she asked about the lack of eyes and the actions of his subjects. He answered very philosophically, and everything was related to the redemption of their sins in their world of the living. After the ruler of the dead was killed, his heart fell to the ground. Then the king became a shadow and grabbed the heart before successfully disappearing with it in his hands. Thus, one of the kings disappeared somewhere in the castle. Currently, the main heroine was fighting alone against a horde of undead. She had to pass through a narrow pass where there were even more monsters. She would have preferred not to fight them, but slipping by was not an option. Suddenly, she saw an arrow strike against the rocks and attract the attention of the undead. Looking up to where the arrow was shot, she saw the Duke of the East. She smiled at the young man and was very grateful to him for his help. Lignan's subordinate approached him, and it was time for the troop to head to the castle of the undead king. But the young man remembered the main heroine's words and ordered his men not to go to the castle, but rather to collect trophies. The heroine was very pleased that her friend listened to her. Suddenly, a northern arrow flew right next to her. She looked up to another cliff and saw her father with his troops giving orders to shoot all the archers. Numerous arrows flew towards the main heroine. Rena used the body of one of the undead as a shield, and through it, she looked at her father who was looking at his daughter without any emotion, as if he had come to kill her. Rena beckoned the monsters to gather around her, using them as shields while the arrows killed her foes, allowing her to escape. This enraged the Marquis, who never imagined that the girl could hide behind the undead. In fact, one of his knights had reported that the monsters were encircling their troop. He temporarily relinquished command to someone else when he saw the battered girl among the horde of undead. He had to finish what he started. The Marquis and a few warriors approached the heroine. Her father noticed that she was wounded and realized that he had a better chance of killing her now. If Rena truly wanted to live, she would have hidden for the rest of her days, but she chose to live under her true name. So the man ordered his knights to kill the heroine. Rena did not waste her time fighting the horde of warriors and instead threw the body of one of the undead at them, then ran towards her father. She took a dagger, but plunged it not into him, but into the rock behind him. Stones fell, and behind them was not a cliff but an abyss into which she threw her father. The man thought it was the end, but Rena grabbed his hand. She feigned being injured so that he would come down to her. She had no plans of killing the Marquis now, but she would if he did not make the right decision before they reached the tomb. Rena then pulled her enemy up, and while he was still in shock from what had just happened, she told him that the reason the dead had become monsters was that each one had killed their own child for personal gain. However, the Marquis did not resemble a monster at all. He was nothing more than a coward. He put his hands on the girl's shoulders and called her a monster, and it was then that Rena realized too late that he wore a ring with a poisonous spike on it. She did not have time to do anything as her father simply pushed her off the edge. If Rena ever returned home, the man might recognize her, but only as a monster. The Marquis returns to the second prince who fights, utilizing his powers to the fullest. Despite being exhausted, he continues to slay the undead. Additionally, he is angry at the main heroine's father for disappearing from the battlefield. The young man is not willing to retreat, but ultimately, he falls powerless to the ground. Furthermore, one of the warriors from their squad rushes in a panic to report the destruction of the castle of the dead king, now replaced by a swamp. The undead are also nowhere to be seen. They return empty-handed, so they decide to search for treasures. However, after several days, they still cannot find anything and have not seen any warriors from other regions. Therefore, the North can safely return victorious to the land of the living. In the world of the living, most northerners return with heavy injuries. At first, they speak proudly to the cardinal, believing that merely surviving is already a great feat. However, the Duke of the East emerges from the tomb with his knights, carrying a huge bag of gold and other trophies. The Marquis is shocked, as he cannot understand where in that swamp they could have found gold. It turned out that the Easterners spent several more days in the tomb, and time probably flows differently for each person there. Meanwhile, the castle collapsed not just because it was abandoned, but because the king's heart was already brought out on the following day. Rena did it, and she was now getting her wounds treated at the tomb entrance, with her father behind her. The Marquis could not comprehend how this could happen and why the girl was still alive. The girl's father was furious, demanding to see the king's heart. When he sees a small ring on a velvet pillow, he decides that it is a fake. Then, the cardinal rebukes him for his ignorance of the empress's biography. After all, it states that she has already seen the king's heart once, and now the ruler confirms that it is indeed the same one. Rena is gifted a silver key for her victory, and the main heroine approaches her father at the moment when the cardinal announces the group's return to the castle. The man has lost to his daughter once again, as he has not killed her and does not deserve forgiveness. This is the end of the first part. If you would like me to make a second part of this manhwa, please support the channel by giving it a like and leaving a comment. Additionally, please subscribe to the channel to stay updated on new videos.